So my name is David Patterson, based here at AFBI Hillsborough, and I've been told not to put that beside me. So there's a number of challenges facing our dairy farm grassland-based systems. There are economic challenges. Don't need to tell you about the fluctuations in fertilizer prices, meal prices, and energy prices. There are challenges around environment, with trying to reduce our carbon footprint and meeting mitigation targets and net zero. There's also the challenge around erratic weather patterns and long-term climate change, and that's what I want to focus on mostly today in this talk. So there's two parts to it. Number one, I want to talk about some of the long-term changes in grass growth, and second of all, look at some of the steps that we can take, practical steps that we can take in the short, medium and long term to deal with some of those long-term changes in grass growth. So if we first of all look back at our grass check growth chart for last year, just look at 1 year first of all. You can see there, I hope, the green line is the 2023 grass growth curve. The red line is the average, the 10-year rolling average of grass production. And the grass check plots are just sitting right behind us over here. So that's where we get our data from. We've been running that for about 25 years now. So if we look at 1 year, there was below average growth here in May, June. And again, you all remember how last summer went, July onwards. The basic point here is that in May and June we had extreme dry and extreme temperatures. So we had a dip in grass production, and then for the opposite reasons, from July onwards we had a very wet, cool summer period. So it's just an example of those erratic weather patterns that we seem to be getting more and more of. And 3 out of the last 5 years here in Northern Ireland, there's been a significant drought period somewhere in the growing season. So it just illustrates the challenges that we're facing. It's not just challenges with erratic weather, it's challenges with utilising grass. And we've had those challenges this spring for sure. But we have 25 years of data almost in grass check, so we had a look at that and we divided it into the first decade and the second decade, and we started to see some changes in the amount of grass grown and the distribution of that grass. So what we did was we took our AFBI grass growth prediction model. We layered on top of that, I think it was the UK CP 15 weather scenarios for each year, ran the combined model, and this graph up here is probably the most important graph of the whole talk. This shows us what the annual grass production is going to be. We pointed it back as far as 1900, and we then pointed it forward right through to the year 2100. And I hope you can see straight away that the average growth was reasonably steady. This centre line is the average annual grass growth for Northern Ireland. So this sort of work has never been done before. Average grass growth was reasonably steady up to the early 2000s. And then, as I say, we saw from our own grass check data, actual numbers, not models, actual numbers were showing that something was changing. But when we ran the model, I think it was ran 3,000 times to get this, you can see what happens between here and 2100. So there's going to be, our prediction is, there's going to be approximately an extra 2 tons of grass dry matter that you can grow across the season. But with that comes challenges. The challenges being, if there is an increase in annual temperatures due to climate change, it also brings more moisture. So we may have more growth in the late spring, and we will also get more growth going into the back end of the year in October, November. But we'll have a lot more rain. For every 1 degree C increase with climate change, you get 7% more rainfall. So there's good news and bad news. More bad news. In the middle part of the growing season, we picked out 3 months, June, July and August, and they all looked like this one. So the prediction is from here to 2100, the average grass growth in those core summer months, June, July and August, will be relatively flat. But these upper and lower limits show the volatility, the fluctuations in grass growth are going to be much, much more. And like I said at the very outset, we've seen that already in particular years over this last 25 years from our grass check data. So that's the first key message for today as to what's likely to change over this next 75 years or so, according to the model. So if we move on, what can we do about that? What mitigations can we build in? What changes can we make to our grassland farming systems right now? So I've picked out just some. There's a short-term measure here, a couple of medium-term options, and a longer-term option over here to try and mitigate some of these predicted changes that we're going to encounter. First of all, it's the basics of good grassland management. Short-term measures that you can all adopt. It's about measuring grass, assessing grass, grass budgeting. Can't go into all the detail of that. There's a whole talk on that in itself. But what we have found is that the farmers that are doing that, particularly our own grass check farmers, with about 50 of them working with Agri-Search and ourselves, they plot out these paddock performance charts, produces a grass wedge, and you can manage your grass using the grass check predictions from over here, manage your grass wedge and improve your grassland utilisation. Now all that does is try to flatten out the day by day, week by week variations in grass growth that you get throughout the growing season. It's gone down to about 40 recently. We should be getting at least 60 normally at this time of year. So there's benefits there in terms of utilisation and money made. The next step in the medium term is to try and harness the power of legumes in our swards. The sward behind you is a multi-species sward, and we'll get to that in a moment, but it has red clover in that. So what we're talking about here is red clover in silage swards, white clover in grazing swards, and there's a bit of crossover in those two. This is just one set of results from a number of years ago, work done on red clover with dairy cows here at AFBI Hillsborough, and it just shows, that's just one chart of many, shows the potential production, milk production from red clover grass silage. And you can see here that it was actually similar in the first two cuts, and the third cut there was a benefit in terms of milk production. So there are benefits there in terms of incorporating legumes, fertilizer saved. We ran these calculations based on a 100 cow dairy herd, typical stocking rate, and even just with 25%, not all of the ground, 25% of your grazing ground, red clover, 25% converted to white clover in the grazing. And that's the sort of benefits you can achieve, financial benefits, physical benefits, and all importantly, the environmental challenge, reducing that carbon footprint, in this case, purely down to the fertilizer not spread. Moving on a little bit further, if we look closer into the sward itself, we can introduce other species. Now, I'm not just talking about multi-species here, I'm talking about looking back at other grasses. Grasses maybe with deeper rooting, to ride out some of these changes that we're going to incur, more dry spells, more wet spells. First of all, look at other grasses, but when we talk about multi-species swards, the advantages there are bringing together different species with different growth rhythms. You can see the typical grass growth curve right there in green. The herbs and the clovers tend to come through later in the season. So that, again, can try to flatten out the grass supply curve and mitigate some of those erratic weather patterns. And deeper rooting as well. What we found with dairy young stock, 2 years of grazing trials here a couple of years ago, higher daily live weight gains, and just switching it over to soil health. You heard a lot about soils at the last stop. Improvements, we significantly found higher populations of the deep burrowing earthworms below those multi-species swards. Final point, maybe a bit more controversial, 2 minutes to go, is can we introduce trees into our grassland? Now, I'm not talking about necessarily dense woodland, and I'm not talking about just along riparian strips. Proper agroforestry areas where we're integrating grazing and trees and grassland all together. And just one aspect of the benefits of that, the work done down at Loch Gall, AFBI Loch Gall, showed that, well, to explain the chart, the 40% soil moisture is critical. Above 40%, the soil surface is not trafficable or not grazable without damage. Okay? So what we found was after 28 years of studies down there, the agroforestry area was below that danger line of 40% for most of the autumn and again in the spring. So there was an extra 17 weeks of grazable time whenever they introduced the trees into the grassland. So there's opportunities there, maybe to have one field on the farm. It could be your go-to field whenever the grass is either not going well on your main platform or in heavy rain conditions. There's practical implications there. So 17 weeks of extra grazing under agroforestry, and there was a carbon saving there when you combine the trees and the grass. So with that, I will have to stop.